A boot heel came down hard on a woman's crutch and snapped it clean in two. She dropped. Her knee cracked against the floorboards and the whole room laughed. A young man kicked the broken piece across the diner like it was a game. Nobody helped her up. Nobody moved. She just knelt there, one hand pressed flat to the cold wood, breathing slow through her teeth. This was the fourth time this month they'd done it to her. Everybody in that little Montana town had already decided what she was. Too broken, too quiet, too ruined to matter. Her name was Della Prewitt, and she had long since stopped arguing. But out on the road, an old motorcycle was rumbling closer, a gray dog riding in the sidecar. What that stranger did 3 days later left the whole town unable to speak. Stay with me on this one. Now, to understand what happened, you have to understand Della. So let me back up a little. She'd worked the counter at the Blue Kettle Diner for 11 years, poured coffee before the sun came up, wiped the same 12 tables until the pattern wore off them. She knew every trucker's order by heart and every farmer's grudge by name. She knew which old men took their eggs runny and which ones would send them back twice out of pure orneriness. And for the first 9 of those years, nobody thought a thing about her one way or the other. She was just Della, quick with a plate, slow to complain. The kind of woman a town leans on without ever once saying thank you. Then came the night on the Bridge Road. It was a wet March 2 years back. Della was driving home after close, headlights swimming in the rain, tired down to her bones the way you only get after a double shift. A truck came around the bend on her side of the line. She never even had time to scream. The 2 vehicles hit and hers went through the guardrail and down the bank toward the creek. They pulled her out an hour later with her left leg pinned and folded the wrong way, her voice long gone from calling for help nobody could hear. The other driver didn't make it. Della lived. But she came back changed. The doctors did what they could, and what they could left her with a leg that dragged, a hip that locked up in the cold, and a scar that ran from her ankle clean up past her knee, thick and pale as a rope. She walked with a crutch now, some days a cane on the good ones, and something behind her eyes had gone quiet. Folks noticed that more than the limp. Here's the thing about a small town. It doesn't know what to do with a person who breaks. A wedding it understands. A funeral it understands. But a woman who used to be pretty and quick, now dragging herself between the tables that made people uncomfortable. And people who are uncomfortable get cruel, not all at once, a little at a time. Like water on a stone, it started with the pity which she could stand. Then it turned to jokes which she couldn't. The regulars stopped meeting her eyes. When she brought their plates, they'd talk right over her like she was a piece of the furniture. The young men who came in loud on Friday nights found out she wouldn't fight back, and that made her a target. They'd trip her tray, move her crutch when she set it down, slide a foot out when she passed, just to watch her stumble and catch herself on a chair back, call her the cripple of the Blue Kettle and laugh like it was the funniest thing in 3 counties. The worst of them was Wade Tolliver. Big, handsome, mean the way only a spoiled boy can be mean. His daddy owned half the feed business in town, and Wade had never once been told no. He'd taken a special interest in Della, the way a bored cat takes an interest in a wounded bird. It was Wade who'd snapped her crutch that morning. It was Wade who kept the whole thing going, because when the strong pick a weak one to torment, everybody else falls in line just to stay on the safe side. Nobody wanted to be next. So they laughed when Wade laughed, and they looked at their coffee when he went too far. And Della let them. That's the part that's hard to hear, I know. But you have to understand what breaking does to a person. It doesn't just hurt the body. It teaches you a lesson over and over until you believe it. And the lesson she'd learned was simple. Keep your head down, take up less room, ask for nothing. Because the world has already decided what you're worth, and fighting it only makes the fall harder. So she poured the coffee, and she scrubbed the tables. And she went home to a rented room above the hardware store, and she did not cry because she'd used up all of that a long time ago. Then the flyer went up. It was the church ladies' idea mostly. Every summer Cedar Falls held what they called a widow's dance at the town hall. Started years back as a way for the war widows to have one night that wasn't lonely, and over time it grew into the whole town's business. Fiddle music, folding tables of pie, string lights across the ceiling. Everybody came. And every unmarried woman in town was expected to stand up and be asked. When Loretta from the church pinned that flyer by the register, she smiled at Della and said, real sweet, "You'll come this year, honey. Do you a world of good to get out." Della just nodded and kept wiping the counter. But inside something went cold, because she knew exactly what that night would be. She'd stand against the wall with the older widows and the young men would swagger past her to the pretty girls, and if any of them so much as glanced her way, it would only be to snicker to his friends. She'd already lived that night in her head 100 times, and it ended the same way every time. She almost didn't go. Lord, she came so close to just staying home. But Loretta kept after her, and the other waitress, a kind older woman named Pearl, offered to help her fix her hair. Pearl said it soft, like it wasn't a favor at all. "Let me just do your hair, Della. It'd give me the pleasure." And something about the way she said it made it hard to say no. So on the night of the dance, Della put on the one good dress she still owned, a soft blue thing that had fit better before the wreck, and she let Pearl pin her hair up, and she walked the 3 blocks to the town hall with her cane clicking on the sidewalk and her heart pounding like a drum. She had no idea a motorcycle was already parked out front. The town hall was full and warm and loud. Fiddles sawing away in the corner, boots stomping the floor, the smell of coffee and cut watermelon everywhere. Della slipped in along the side wall and found her spot near the older widows, and for a while she let herself just watch. It was almost nice, standing in the dark edge of all that light. The young couples spun by. Somebody's baby cried and got hushed. For a few minutes she let herself pretend she was just another woman at a dance, but it didn't last. It never did. Wade Tolliver spotted her within 10 minutes. He came sauntering over with 2 of his friends, and he leaned against the wall beside her with that easy, cruel grin. "Well, look who dragged herself down here," he said, loud enough for the folks nearby to hear. "You waiting for somebody to ask you to dance, Della, that it?" His friends snorted. "That's real optimistic. You know a man's got to be able to lean on his partner. You take us both down like a sack of grain." The people close enough to hear looked away, the way people do. Not one of them said a word. And Della felt her face go hot and her eyes sting, and she gripped her cane and stared at the floor and prayed for it to be over. "Come on now, don't cry," Wade said, delighted. "I'm just being honest. Somebody ought to be. You're too broke to bother with, Darlin. Everybody here knows it. Nobody's gonna dance with the diner cripple." He straightened up and spread his hands to the room like he was making a proclamation. "Any takers? No. Yeah, didn't think so." A few people laughed. Nervous laughs, the kind that come out when folks are ashamed of themselves and don't have the spine to stop. Della turned to go. She was going to leave. She had her hand on her cane and her weight already shifting toward the door, one thought hammering in her skull, get out before they see you cry. And that's when a chair scraped back on the far side of the hall. It wasn't loud, but somehow the whole room heard it. A man stood up from the corner table by the coffee urn where he'd been sitting quiet the whole night with a cup in front of him. He was old, 60s, maybe more. Tall, but bent a little at the shoulders like a man who'd carried heavy things a long time. Silver beard down his chest, weathered face, deep lines, hands like tree bark. He wore an old leather vest gone soft with age, and there was a gray shepherd dog lying at his feet that lifted its head as he rose. Nobody knew him. He'd rolled into town that afternoon on an old motorcycle with a sidecar, and folks had figured him for a drifter passing through. Now he set his coffee cup down on the table, real slow and deliberate, and he walked across that floor. His boots were the only sound in the room. Every eye followed him. And he walked straight up to Della and stopped, and he took off his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and gravelly and calm as still water. "My name's Cyrus Vane. Folks mostly call me Preacher." Della stared at him. She didn't know what to say. Half the town was waiting for him to laugh, waiting for this to be some new joke, the drifter in on it with Wade, about to make the humiliation complete. But Preacher didn't laugh. He just held out his hand to her, big and scarred and steady. "Would you do me the honor of a dance?" he said. The room went dead silent. Even the fiddle stopped. Wade let out a bark of a laugh. "You serious, old man? You seen her leg? She can't hardly walk." Preacher didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes on Della, and he tipped his head a little, gentle as anything, and he said the words that would echo around that town for years after. "I'll take her exactly as she is." Della's breath caught. She looked at that outstretched hand, and she looked up at his face, searching it for the cruelty, for the trick, for the trap she'd learned to expect from every soul in this town. And she didn't find it. There wasn't a drop of pity in his eyes either. Just a plain, quiet steadiness, like he was asking the most ordinary thing in the world. Her hand was shaking when she put it in his. He didn't yank her out to the middle of the floor. He waited. He let her set her own pace, let her lean her weight the way she needed, and he moved slower than the music, really, just a gentle sway. He kept one hand light at her back and the other holding hers, and when her bad leg buckled a little, his arm was already there, solid as a beam, so that nobody watching even saw it happen. He turned it into part of the dance. When she looked up at him, uncertain, he gave her the smallest nod, like to say, "You're doing fine, I've got you." And a strange thing moved through that hall. The snickering died. The mothers by the pie tables put their hands to their mouths. Old widows who hadn't cried in years had wet eyes. Because there in the middle of the floor was the woman they'd all written off, dancing, actually dancing, held up by a stranger who looked at her like she was worth holding. Pearl started clapping. Then Loretta. Then the fiddle player picked his bow back up, soft, and the whole room, shamed and moved all at once, began to clap along. Della laughed. It came out of her like something breaking loose, half a laugh and half a sob, and for the length of one song she forgot her leg entirely. She forgot Wade. She forgot 2 years of keeping her head down. She just danced, in the arms of a man she'd met 2 minutes before, under the string lights, while the town that had thrown her away watched with tears running down their faces. When the song ended, Preacher stepped back and bowed to her, formal as a gentleman in a picture book, and folks actually cheered. He walked her to a chair and eased her down into it and said he'd fetch her some water, and off he went toward the urn with his old dog padding along behind him. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt finished. It felt like the whole thing had turned. The town had seen its own cruelty in the mirror and been ashamed. Della sat there catching her breath, warm and dazed and happier than she'd been in 2 years, watching this kind old stranger pour her a paper cup of water at the coffee table. People were smiling at her. Somebody brought her a slice of peach pie. It was over. The good guy had come, and the ugliness was done, and everything was going to be all right now. That's what everybody in that hall believed. They were wrong, because Wade Tolliver was still standing against the wall, and Wade Tolliver did not forget being made a fool of. He'd been humiliated in front of the whole town by a broke-down old man and the woman he'd spent 2 years grinding under his heel. And a boy like Wade would rather burn the whole thing down than let that stand. You could see it working in him from across the room, the grin gone, the jaw tight, the eyes flat and mean. He pushed off the wall and pulled his 2 friends close and muttered something, and one of them slipped out the side door into the dark. I want you to hear what Wade did next, because this is where the story turns from something warm into something else entirely. He walked over to where the sheriff was leaning against the doorframe, Sheriff Bud Hollies, a heavy, slow man who owed Wade's daddy money and knew it, and Wade started talking fast and low, pointing across the room at Preacher. And whatever he said, the sheriff's face changed. He straightened up. His hand drifted down to rest on his belt. Here's the thing about a lie in a small town. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be told by the right mouth to the right ear. That old man's wanted, Wade was saying, loud enough now for it to carry. I seen his face on a bulletin down in Billings. Drifter biker killed a man in a bar fight. And they let him put his hands all over a woman in this town. He turned to the crowd and his voice climbed. How do we know he's not casing this whole place? How do we know Della didn't set it up? Two of a kind, those two. And just like that, the whole feeling of the room flipped. The same folks who'd been crying 2 minutes before now looked at Preacher sideways, uneasy, half believing, because it's always easier to believe the worst than to admit you were wrong. Fear moves through a crowd faster than shame ever could. The sheriff crossed the floor with 3 deputized ranch hands falling in behind him, and they surrounded the old man at the coffee table, and Sheriff Hollies put his hand on his gun and said, "Mister, you're gonna want to come with me. Real slow. You see what happened there. A minute ago this was a story about one cruel boy and a dance. Now it was a man alone in a strange town, an old dog at his feet, 4 armed men around him, and a lie already spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about whether Cyrus Vane walked out of Cedar Falls alive. And Della saw all of it from her chair, the peach pie forgotten in her lap, her heart going cold as creek water. The one person who'd ever stood up for her was about to pay for it. And she knew right down in her gut, that if she sat there quiet like she'd trained herself to do, they'd take him, and she'd never see him again. Now if this story's got its hooks in you, if you've ever been the one everybody wrote off, or you've ever wished somebody would just walk across the room and take your hand, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stick around, because what this old man did next is the reason I'm telling you this at all. Della got to her feet. She didn't reach for her cane. She left it leaning against the chair, and she took a step out onto that floor without it, wobbling, her bad leg screaming, and she said in a voice louder than anybody in that town had heard from her in 2 years, "He didn't do anything. Leave him be." The room turned to look at her. Wade sneered, "Sit down, cripple, before you fall." And Preacher, who had not moved, who had let those 4 men circle him without so much as flinching, finally spoke. He raised one big hand, slow, palm open, toward Della. "It's all right, Darlin," he said gently. "Sit down and rest that leg. Nobody here is going to hurt anybody." Then he looked at the sheriff and his voice stayed just as calm, but something underneath it went hard as iron. "You want to know who I am, Sheriff? I'll tell you who I am, in front of everybody, and when I'm done, you're going to wish you'd never listened to that boy." Sheriff Hollies hesitated. There was something in the old man's stillness that didn't fit a guilty drifter. A guilty man runs, or he begs, or he swings. This one just stood there, steady as a fence post. "Then talk," he said. Preacher reached into his vest slow so nobody got jumpy, and he pulled out a worn leather wallet, and from it a photograph cracked and soft at the corners from being held too many times. He held it up so the room could see. It was a picture of a young man, maybe 25, dark hair and easy grin. "This is my son," Preacher said. His name was Danny. His voice didn't break, but it dropped, and every soul in that hall leaned in to hear it. 2 years ago this coming March, my boy got drunk in a bar down the highway. He'd been drinking for a while by then. I couldn't reach him anymore, hadn't been able to for years. That's a failure I'll carry to my grave. And that night, drunk as a lord, he got in his truck. and he drove up the bridge road in the rain on the wrong side of the line. The room went utterly still. Somewhere a woman gasped. You could hear the string lights humming. Della's pie plate slid off her lap and shattered on the floor. She didn't hear it. She was staring at the photograph, at that young man's grinning face, and the ground was falling away beneath her. My boy died on that road, Preacher went on, quiet. And I spent a long time only thinking about that, my grief, my loss. It took me most of a year to make myself find out the truth of it, that Danny didn't die alone out there, that he crossed the line into another car, a car with a woman in it. A woman coming home from her job at a diner. He turned then, slow, and he looked straight at Della me Prewitt. A woman who lived, but who's been paying for my son's mistake every single day since. Nobody breathed. I sold near everything I had, Preacher said. Got on my old bike and I started riding. And everywhere Danny left a wound, I stopped, and I stood in front of the people he hurt, and I looked them in the eye and I said I'm sorry on behalf of a boy who can't say it himself. I've been doing it 2 years now, family by family, a widow in Idaho, a man in Cheyenne whose brother my boy put in a chair. I sat in their kitchens and I took whatever they had to give me, and some of it was hard to hear, and I deserved every word. This town, his voice caught, just once. This town was the last name on my list, because she was the one my boy hurt worst of all. And I have been driving here for 2 years, terrified, because how do you look at a woman whose whole life your child broke and ask her to forgive you? He walked toward Della, and the sheriff and his men parted like water, because there wasn't a man in that room who could have laid a hand on him now. I got into town this afternoon, Preacher said, standing over her. And I sat in the corner of this hall trying to find the courage to walk up and tell you who I was. I had it all worked out, the words I was going to use. And instead I watched that boy break your crutch with his words in front of this whole town, and I watched not one single person here stand up for you. He looked around the room, and the shame in that hall was thick enough to touch. So I figured, before I told you the ugly truth of who I am, the least I could do, the very least, was ask you to dance, and find out for myself the thing I already knew in my bones, that you were never broken. This whole town just decided you were, so they didn't have to look at you. Della was crying now, not the silent kind she'd trained herself into. The real kind, shaking, ugly, alive. You're his father, she whispered. I am. He killed himself and he near killed me and you. You rode 2 years to say sorry. I did. Preacher lowered himself down, slow, his old knees cracking until he was kneeling on the floor in front of her chair, right there in the broken peach pie, an old man on his knees before the woman his son had ruined. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight, he said. Might be you never can, and that be fair. I only came to look you in the eye and tell you the truth. That what happened to you wasn't your fault. It was my boy's, and it was mine for not saving him. Not 1 ounce of it was ever yours. He took her hand the way he had on the dance floor. You hear me, Della me, not 1 ounce. And the whole hall watched a broken woman and a grieving father hold each other and weep, and there wasn't a dry eye left in Cedar Falls. The string lights burned overhead. The fiddle player wiped his face with his sleeve. Sheriff Bud Hollis took his hand off his gun. He turned around real slow and looked at Wade Tolliver, who'd gone pale as a sheet against the wall. You told me that man was a killer, the sheriff said. You told me you saw his face on a bulletin in Billings. The silence stretched. You made that up. In front of God and this whole town, to get back at a woman for being danced with. Bud Hollis had owed Wade's daddy money for years, and maybe that's why what he did next surprised everybody. He walked over and took Wade by the collar and marched him toward the door. You're gonna sit in my jail tonight and think about what kind of man you're turning into. Get. Wade went out cussing, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Something had changed in that room, and everybody could feel it, and it could not be taken back. Della and Preacher stayed at the town hall a long while after, sitting together at the corner table with the coffee urn, and one by one, the people of Cedar Falls came up to them. And here is the part I think about most. They didn't come to gawk. They came to apologize. Pearl first, then Loretta, then old men who'd looked away for 2 years while a boy tormented her over their morning coffee. Farmers who'd laughed at the jokes. Mothers who'd pulled their kids past her on the sidewalk. One at a time, they stood in front of Della Me Prewitt and said they were sorry. Some of them cried doing it. She took every one of their hands. She didn't have to, but she did. That's the kind of person she'd been all along, underneath what they'd made her believe about herself. Preacher stayed in Cedar Falls. He'd meant to move on the next morning. His list was finished, after all, Della being the last name on it. But somehow the next morning came and he was still there. And so was Diesel, that old gray shepherd, asleep in a patch of sun outside the blue kettle. He fixed the loose step at the diner's back door. Then he fixed the sagging gutter. Folks started finding little things mended around town that they hadn't asked anybody to mend. He took a room down the hall from Della's, above the hardware store. And every morning he'd walk her to work, slow, matching her pace, his hand ready but never grabbing, and every evening he'd walk her home. They didn't rush anything. Two people who'd both been broken by the same terrible night on the same terrible road don't need to rush. They understood each other in a way words couldn't reach. He'd lost a son. She'd lost the life she was supposed to have. And somehow, out of all that wreckage, they found they could sit on the steps in the evening and just be quiet together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Della kept working the counter, but it wasn't the same counter anymore. When Friday night boys came in loud, looking for someone weak to torment, they found the whole diner would go still and stare them down, and they'd think better of it and eat their eggs and leave. The town had learned something it wasn't going to unlearn. You could see it in how they said her name now, with respect, the way they should have all along. Wade Tolliver's daddy sent him off to a ranch in Wyoming that fall to work under a foreman who didn't care whose son he was. Some say he came back years later a quieter, better man. Some say he never came back at all. I don't know which is true, and honestly, this was never his story. As for the leg, it never healed. Let me be honest with you, because this isn't that kind of tale. Della limped the rest of her days. Cold mornings still locked up her hip. The scar never faded. But here's what changed, and it's the only thing that ever really matters. She stopped hiding it. She'd wear a dress that showed it now. She'd set her cane against the counter and dare anybody to say a word. Because a man had knelt in a broken pie in front of the whole town and told her the truth, that she was never the broken thing. She just believed the people who needed her to be. Preacher married her the following spring in that same town hall under those same string lights. Loretta baked the pies. Pearl fixed her hair. The whole town came, and this time when the fiddle started and Cyrus Vane held out his hand, there wasn't a soul in Cedar Falls who thought it was anything but the most natural thing in the world. He was an old man, and he didn't get as many years as she'd have wanted. But he got enough. And when he passed, quiet, in that room above the hardware store with Diesel's old graying head on the bed beside him, Della was holding his hand. The same big, scarred, steady hand he'd held out to her across a crowded room the night everybody else looked away. She lived a long time after that, ran the diner herself in the end, and she never once let a single person be laughed at under her roof, not the slow, not the strange, not the broken. When she saw somebody standing alone against the wall while the world passed them by, she'd walk over slow, with her cane clicking on the floor, and she'd hold out her hand. And she'd say the only words she ever needed, "I'll take you exactly as you are."